The airstrip shouldn't have existed anymore. According to county records filed 3 months prior, the land had been seized, the asphalt condemned, the entire operation shut down by a combination of debt and bureaucratic indifference. Yet there it sat in the high desert of eastern Oregon, a single ribbon of cracked pavement cutting through sagebrush and dust, maintained by a man who had nowhere else to go. His name was Roland Voss, 67 years old, a farmer who'd lost everything except the belief that someone someday would need this strip of forgotten runway. Every morning he walked its length with a push broom, clearing stones and tumbleweeds. Every evening he checked the lights he'd jury-rigged from solar panels and car batteries. Nobody asked why. Nobody came. On the night of October 14th, the sky above the Oregon high desert was moonless and vast, the kind of darkness that swallowed sound. Roland sat on the porch of his gutted farmhouse, drinking coffee that had gone cold hours ago. The foreclosure notice was still taped to the door. He'd stopped reading it. At 11:43, his radio crackled. It was a handheld aviation unit, ancient and barely functional, something he'd kept out of habit more than hope. The voice that came through was clipped, professional and desperate. Any station, this is Reach 71 Heavy. We are declaring an emergency. Require immediate runway, any length, any condition. Multiple casualties on board, fuel critical. Roland sat forward. His hands didn't shake. They hadn't shaken in 30 years, not since his own time in uniform. He keyed the mic. Reach 71, this is Voss Field. Unmanned civilian strip 4,000 feet unlit. Condition unknown. Advise caution. There was a pause. Then the voice came back, and this time it was different. Calmer, almost relieved. Voss Field, Reach 71, we'll take it. Can you provide any guidance? Roland stood and walked to the breaker box he'd installed himself. He threw the switches one by one. Down the length of the runway, salvaged LEDs flickered to life, dim but visible, a glowing thread in the void. He keyed the mic again. Lights are up. Wind negligible. You're cleared for whatever you need to do. Copy, we're 10 minutes out. Roland set the radio down and stared at the horizon. He thought about his daughter who'd stopped calling. He thought about the bank, the county, the 53 certified letters he'd ignored. He thought about why he'd kept this place alive when everything else had died. And then he heard it. A low rumble, distant but growing, the unmistakable sound of heavy engines clawing through thin air. The C-17 Globemaster descended like a falling cathedral, vast and impossible against the stars. Its silhouette blotted out constellations as it lined up with the glowing thread of Roland's runway. Inside the cockpit, Captain Lucia Harrow was flying on fumes and willpower. Her co-pilot, a sharp-eyed lieutenant named Grayson, read off altitudes with the precision of a metronome, but both of them knew the math. They had maybe 3 minutes of fuel left. Maybe. The aircraft commander, a broad-shouldered major named Takeda, stood behind them in the cockpit, one hand braced against the bulkhead, watching the darkness below for any sign of the lights they'd been promised. Still nothing, Takeda muttered. He said they're up, Harrow replied, her voice tight. I believe him. Grayson shot her a look. You believe a random farmer in the middle of nowhere. I believe anyone who answers a mayday. Her hands moved across the controls with the economy of someone who'd logged 5,000 hours in everything from cargo runs to combat insertions. They called her widow in the squadrons, not because of her marital status, but because of a mission over the Hindu Kush 3 years prior, when she'd brought back a shot-up transport alone after her co-pilot bled out beside her. Nobody mocked the call sign. Not anymore. The C-17's landing lights carved tunnels through the void. And then, faint as dying embers, the runway lights appeared. A thin line of amber and white, crooked in places, but there. Real. Visual, Harrow said softly. I have the runway. Takeda exhaled. Gear down, let's get these people on the ground. The landing gear groaned into position. Harrow adjusted trim, throttle, pitch. The C-17 was never graceful, but in her hands it moved with a kind of brutal elegance. The desert floor rushed up. The lights steadied. Grayson called out airspeed, 60 knots, 50, 40. The main gear kissed pavement with a jolt that rattled every rivet in the airframe, and Harrow deployed thrust reversers immediately, engines screaming in protest. The aircraft shuddered, slowed, finally stopped with 100 feet of runway to spare. For a moment nobody spoke, then Take-Two clapped Harrow on the shoulder. "Hell of a landing, widow." She didn't respond. She was staring out at the darkness beyond the windscreen, where a single figure stood beside a battered pickup truck, illuminated by headlights. Roland Voss raised one hand in a slow, deliberate wave. Harrow keyed the intercom. "Loadmaster, open the ramp. Let's get our people out." Behind them, in the cargo bay, 23 wounded soldiers lay strapped to litters. They'd been extracted from a training accident in the Cascades, a helicopter collision that had left 2 birds destroyed and a medevac chain in chaos. The C-17 had been the only asset available, and Harrow had pushed it past every recommended limit to get them out. Now, as the ramp lowered and cold desert air flooded the bay, medics scrambled to stabilize the injured for ground transport. Roland approached slowly. He was older than Harrow had expected, weathered and lean, with the kind of face that had forgotten how to smile. She met him at the base of the ramp, still wearing her helmet, visor pushed up. "You Voss?" she asked. He nodded. "You need fuel." "Everything. Food, water, medical supplies if you've got them. We're waiting on a medevac convoy from Boise, but it's 2 hours out." Roland looked past her into the cargo bay, at the rows of injured men and women, some unconscious, others staring at the ceiling with the blank expressions of shock. He turned back to Harrow. "I've got a generator, coffee, some canned goods, not much, but it's yours." "Why?" The question came out harder than she'd intended. "Why keep this place running?" Roland studied her for a long moment. "Because I knew someone would need it." Harrow held his gaze, then she nodded. "Thank you." He waved it off and walked back to his truck. Take-Two appeared beside her, arms crossed. "Interesting guy." "He saved 23 lives tonight," Harrow said quietly. "That makes him more than interesting." The hours that followed blurred together. Roland brought thermoses of coffee, blankets pulled from a storage shed, a portable heater that barely worked but gave off enough warmth to matter. Harrow and her crew moved through the cargo bay, checking vitals, redistributing supplies, speaking in low tones to soldiers who asked where they were and how they'd gotten there. When the medevac convoy finally arrived, a line of ambulances and National Guard trucks with flashing lights, the transfer happened quickly. By 3 in the morning, the last patient was loaded and gone. Harrow stood on the runway, watching the taillights disappear into the desert. Grayson and Take-Two were already back in the cockpit, running post-flight checks. Roland was shutting down his lights, one breaker at a time. She walked over to him. "You live here alone?" she asked. "For now." "What happens when the bank takes it?" Roland shrugged. "Same thing that happens to everyone, you disappear." Harrow looked around at the darkened airstrip, the sagging farmhouse, the endless expanse of nothing. "Not tonight," she said. "Tonight you mattered." He didn't respond, but something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile, just an acknowledgement. She turned to leave, then hesitated. "You prior service?" "Army, long time ago." "I figured," she extended a hand. "Captain Lucia Harrow, call sign Widow." He shook it, his grip was firm. "Roland Voss, no call sign, just a farmer." She smiled faintly. "Not just anything, Roland." When the C-17 lifted off 20 minutes later, its engines roaring against the silence, Roland stood in the same spot and watched it climb. The runway lights were off now. The desert was dark again, but for the first time in months, he felt something other than emptiness. Inside the cockpit, Harrow banked east toward Mountain Home Air Force Base. Grayson was filling out the incident report. Take-Two was asleep in the jump seat. The sky ahead was beginning to pale with the first hint of dawn. "You think you'll be okay?" Grayson asked without looking up. Harrow didn't answer right away. She was thinking about the way Roland had moved, the quiet competence, the refusal to ask for anything in return. "I think he's been okay for a long time," she said finally. "We just didn't notice." Grayson nodded slowly. "You going to put this in the report?" "Every word." The C-17 carved through the brightening sky, its shadow racing across the desert below. By the time it landed at Mountain Home, the story had already begun to spread. Not officially, not through channels, but the way stories do in the military, passed from crew to crew, embellished slightly, polished into legend. The farmer who kept a runway alive, the captain who trusted a stranger's voice in the dark, the landing that shouldn't have been possible. 3 days later, Harrow was called into the wing commander's office. Colonel Travers was a man who rarely showed emotion, but when she entered, he was holding a printout of her report and frowning. "Sit," he said. She sat. He tossed the report onto his desk. "You landed a fully loaded C-17 on an unsurveyed civilian airstrip with no ground support, no weather data, and fuel tanks running on fumes." "Yes, sir." "Do you have any idea how many regulations you violated?" "Several, sir." Travers leaned back in his chair. "You also saved 23 lives. Medevac says if you diverted to the nearest confirmed runway, we'd have lost at least 4 of them." He paused. "So here's the situation. I can reprimand you or I can recommend you for a medal. Which would you prefer?" Harrow met his eyes. "Neither, sir. I'd prefer you don't shut down Voss Field." Travers blinked. "Excuse me." "The airstrip. It's being foreclosed. If someone from the Air Force made a call, explained its strategic value, maybe the county would reconsider." "That's not how it works, Captain." "It could be." Travers studied her. "You really think that place is worth saving?" "I know it is." He sighed and picked up his phone. "I'll make some calls, no promises." "Thank you, sir." She stood to leave, but Travers stopped her. "Harrow, why do they call you widow?" She hesitated. "Hindu Kush 2022. Lost my co-pilot over the mountains. Brought the bird back alone." "I read the file. You flew for 6 hours with a dead man beside you." "Yes, sir." "And you never requested a transfer, never asked for leave?" "No, sir." Travers nodded slowly. "You're a hell of a pilot, Captain. Don't let the weight kill you." Harrow didn't respond. She saluted and left. 2 weeks later, Roland received a letter from the county. The foreclosure had been postponed pending a review of the property's potential military use. A follow-up letter from the Air Force National Guard liaison explained that Voss Field had been designated an emergency auxiliary strip, eligible for federal maintenance grants and legal protections. Roland read both letters twice, sitting on his porch in the cold morning light. Then he folded them carefully and set them aside. He didn't cry, he'd forgotten how. But that afternoon, he walked the runway with his broom and found himself smiling. The story might have ended there. A clean resolution, a feel-good epilogue, but stories in the military never really end. They spiral outward, intersecting with other lives, other missions, other moments of impossible decision. And Lucia Harrow's story was far from over. 6 months after the emergency landing, she was deployed to Alaska as part of a rapid response airlift unit. The mission was straightforward: supply runs to remote stations, personnel transport, occasional search and rescue. It was the kind of assignment pilots joked about, a punishment disguised as logistics. But Harrow didn't complain. She flew every mission with the same focus she'd brought to the Hindu Kush, the same precision she'd used to land on Roland's airstrip. Her crew changed. Grayson rotated stateside. Takeda moved to a staff position. She flew with new co-pilots, new loadmasters, new faces that blurred together after a while. But the call sign stayed. Widow. They said it with respect now, but the weight of it never lessened. One night in March, during a resupply run to a station near the Brooks Range, the weather turned. What had been forecast as light snow became a whiteout, visibility dropping to zero in minutes. Harrow diverted to an alternate field, a gravel strip used by bush pilots and the occasional military transport. The landing was rough but manageable. They spent the night in the cargo bay, bundled in sleeping bags, waiting for the storm to pass. Her co-pilot, a young lieutenant named Ortiz, asked her about the call sign. "Is it true about the Hindu Kush?" Harrow didn't look at him. "Yeah." "What was his name?" "Captain First Class Marcus Delgado." "Were you close?" "We flew together for 2 years." She paused. "Close enough." Ortiz was quiet for a moment. "Do you still think about it?" "Every time I sit in the left seat." "Does it get easier?" Harrow finally looked at him. "No, but you get stronger." The storm cleared by dawn. They flew back to base without incident. But the conversation stayed with Harrow. She realized she'd been carrying Marcus for 3 years, not as a memory but as a weight. She wondered if Roland felt the same way about his farm, if keeping something alive was just another way of refusing to let go. When her deployment ended, she requested leave and drove back to Oregon. She didn't tell anyone where she was going. She just got in her truck and headed east, following the same roads the medevac convoy had taken months before. It took her most of a day to find Voss Field again. The runway looked different in daylight, smaller somehow, less mythic. But the lights were still there, and the farmhouse still stood. Roland was working on a tractor when she pulled up. He straightened slowly, wiping grease from his hands, and squinted at her. "Captain." "Just Lucia now," she said. "I'm off duty." He nodded. "Coffee?" "Yeah, that'd be good." They sat on the porch drinking coffee that was better than she'd expected, watching the high desert shimmer in the heat. For a while, neither of them spoke. Then Roland asked, "Why'd you come back?" "I wanted to see if this place was real." "And?" She smiled faintly. "It is." "You thought it wasn't." "I thought maybe I'd imagined it, the way you remember things when you're running on empty." She paused. "But it's here, you're here." Roland looked out at the runway. "Got a grant from the Guard. They're sending a crew to repave it next month. Said it might be used for training exercises." "That's good. Funny how things work out." Lucia set down her cup. "I wanted to thank you, not just for the runway, for answering the radio, for believing we'd make it." "Wasn't about belief," Roland said quietly. "It was about not giving up." She nodded. "I know." They sat in silence again. Somewhere in the distance, a hawk circled. The sky was enormous and empty, the kind of sky that made you feel small and infinite at the same time. "You staying long?" Roland asked. "Just tonight. I've got to be back at base by Monday." "You can use the spare room. Not much, but it's clean." "I'd appreciate that." That evening they ate dinner together, simple food cooked on a propane stove. Roland told her about his daughter, who lived in Portland and worked in tech and hadn't visited in 3 years. Lucia told him about Marcus, about the mission that had taken him, about the 6 hours she'd spent alone in the cockpit with his body strapped into the seat beside her. Roland listened without interrupting, and when she finished, he just nodded. "You did what you had to do," he said. "I know. But you don't forgive yourself." She looked at him sharply. "How do you know?" "Because I don't either." She didn't ask what he meant. She didn't need to. They were both haunted by the same thing, survival, the guilt of being the one who made it through. That night she lay in the spare room and stared at the ceiling. She thought about Marcus, about Roland, about the 23 soldiers she'd brought out of the desert. She thought about all the people she'd carried, literally and figuratively, and wondered if she'd ever be able to set them down. But for the first time in years, the thought didn't terrify her. The next morning she thanked Roland and drove away. She didn't know if she'd come back, but she knew the runway would be there, waiting just in case. The months that followed brought new missions, new challenges. Lucia flew cargo runs across the Pacific, evacuation operations during wildfire season, humanitarian drops in disaster zones. Her reputation grew. Pilots asked to fly with her. Commanders requested her by name. The call sign Widow became synonymous with competence, with the kind of unshakable calm that turned chaos into order. But she never forgot Voss Field. And then in late autumn the call came. Not over the radio, not through official channels, just a voicemail on her personal phone left at 3 in the morning. Roland's voice, hoarse and uncertain. "Captain Harrow, this is Roland Voss. I don't know if you remember me, but I need help. It's not an emergency, not yet, but I didn't know who else to call." She listened to the message twice, then dialed him back. He answered on the first ring. "Roland, it's Lucia. What's wrong?" "There's a plane," he said. "Small one. Cessna, I think. It went down about 10 miles north of here, up in the hills. I heard the engine cut out, saw it go down. I called search and rescue, but they're saying the weather's too bad, they can't get a helicopter up until morning." "How do you know someone's alive?" "I don't, but I can't just leave them." Lucia checked the time. She was off duty, technically on leave. Her superiors would not approve, but she didn't hesitate. "I'll be there in 6 hours." "You don't have to." "I'll be there." She hung up, grabbed her gear, and headed for the base. She didn't have authorization to take an aircraft. She didn't have a flight plan, but she had a truck, a satellite phone, and a decades-old familiarity with improvisation. By dawn, she was on the road, driving east into the rising sun. When she arrived at Voss Field, Roland was waiting. He'd already loaded his truck with rope, blankets, first aid supplies, everything he could think of. They didn't waste time on greetings. She climbed into the passenger seat, and they headed north into the hills. The terrain was brutal. Narrow fire roads, loose gravel, steep grades that made the truck's engine scream. Roland drove with the confidence of someone who knew every inch of the land, but even he had to stop twice to winch the truck over obstacles. They reached the crash site just after noon. The Cessna had clipped a ridge and tumbled into a ravine, its fuselage crumpled but mostly intact. Lucia climbed down first, moving carefully over loose rock. The cockpit was empty, but there was blood on the seat. She followed a trail of disturbed earth and found the pilot 50 yards downslope, conscious but badly injured. A woman, mid-40s, with a compound fracture in her left leg and a gash across her forehead. "I've got you," Lucia said, kneeling beside her. "My name's Lucia, I'm a pilot. We're going to get you out." The woman's eyes focused slowly. I thought no one would come." "Someone always comes." Roland appeared with the first aid kit. Together they stabilized the leg, wrapped the wound, gave her water. The woman's name was Dr. Elena Ruiz, a wildlife biologist flying solo to a research site. She'd been caught in a downdraft and lost control. She tried to restart the engine, tried to glide, tried everything. But the mountains had won. Getting her back to the truck took 2 hours. Lucia and Roland improvised a stretcher from a tarp and carried her up the slope, taking turns, stopping every few minutes to rest. By the time they reached the truck, all 3 of them were exhausted. But Elena was alive. They drove her to the nearest hospital, a small facility in Burns that had exactly 1 surgeon on duty. The staff took her immediately. Lucia and Roland sat in the waiting room, covered in dirt and blood, drinking vending machine coffee. After a while, a nurse came out and told them Elena would survive. The leg would need surgery, but she'd walk again. Roland exhaled slowly. "Thank you." Lucia shook her head. "You're the one who heard her go down. You're the one who called." "But you came." "So did you." They sat in silence. Outside, the sun was setting, painting the hills in shades of amber and rust. Lucia thought about all the people she'd saved, all the missions she'd flown, all the impossible landings and desperate calls. She thought about Marcus, about the 23 soldiers, about Roland keeping a runway alive in the middle of nowhere. "Why do you do it?" she asked quietly. Roland looked at her. "Do what?" "Stay, fight, keep going when everything's falling apart." He considered the question for a long time. Because someone has to. She nodded. That was enough. They stayed until Alina was out of surgery, until her family arrived, until there was nothing left to do. Then they drove back to Voss Field in the dark, the truck's headlights cutting through the night. When they arrived, Roland offered her the spare room again, and she accepted. That night, lying in the same bed she'd slept in months before, Lucia finally understood why she'd come back. It wasn't about the runway. It wasn't about Roland. It was about finding a place where the weight didn't crush you, a place where survival wasn't guilt, where doing the right thing didn't require justification. She fell asleep thinking about Alina, about the look in her eyes when she'd realized someone had come. That look was why Lucia flew, why Roland kept his runway lit, why they'd both refused to give up. The next morning, she woke to the smell of coffee and found Roland already outside, sweeping the runway. She joined him, and they worked in companionable silence, clearing debris, checking lights, maintaining a place that the world had tried to forget. "You know," Roland said eventually, "the guard's sending people to train here next month. Pilots. They want to practice remote landings." "That's good. I was thinking, maybe you could come teach them what you know." Lucia stopped sweeping. "I'm not an instructor." "You're better than one. You're someone who's done it." She smiled faintly. "I'll think about it." But they both knew she'd say yes. And she did. 6 weeks later, Captain Lucia, widow, Harrow returned to Voss Field as a guest instructor for a National Guard training exercise. She taught young pilots how to land on improvised runways, how to trust their instruments when visibility dropped to nothing, how to make decisions when every option was bad. She told them about the Hindu Kush, about Marcus, about the night she brought 23 soldiers out of the desert on fumes and faith. The pilots listened with the kind of reverence usually reserved for legends, and in a way, that's what she'd become, not because she was fearless, but because she'd been afraid and flown anyway. Roland watched from the sidelines, arms crossed, a faint smile on his weathered face. His runway, the one he'd kept alive through foreclosure and debt and endless lonely nights, was finally being used the way he'd always imagined, as a lifeline, a second chance, a place where people came back from the edge. After the training ended, Lucia stayed an extra day. She and Roland sat on the porch, watching the sunset, drinking coffee that had gone cold. They didn't talk much. They didn't need to. Some things didn't require words. Before she left, she gave him her personal number. "If you ever need anything," she said, "anything at all." Roland nodded. "Same to you." She drove away, watching the runway shrink in her rearview mirror. But this time, she knew she'd be back, not as a stranger, not as a pilot in distress, but as someone who'd found a place worth returning to. The story could end here, but stories about people like Lucia and Roland don't really end. They echo. They ripple outward. They become the kind of tales that pilots tell in ready rooms and farmers share over fences. Years later, when Lucia finally retired from active duty, she returned to Voss Field one last time. Roland was older, slower, but still sweeping the runway every morning. They sat on the porch and watched the sky, and Lucia told him something she'd never told anyone. "I used to think I was carrying ghosts," she said. "Marcus, the soldiers, everyone I couldn't save, but I was wrong." "What were you carrying?" Roland asked. "Proof," she said quietly, "proof that trying matters, that showing up, even when it's impossible, even when you're running on empty. That's what makes you human." Roland looked at her. "You figured that out on your own." "No," she said, "you taught me, the night you turned on those lights." He didn't respond, but his hand found hers, and they sat together in the fading light, two people who'd refused to disappear, who'd kept their runways lit when the world went dark. And somewhere above them, a C-17 carved through the evening sky, its engines a distant thunder, carrying its own cargo of hope and desperation. The pilot didn't know about Voss Field, didn't know about Roland or Lucia or the impossible landing that had saved 23 lives. But someday maybe they would. Because stories like this don't die. They wait. They endure. They become the kind of legend that keeps people going when everything else has failed. And that in the end is why Roland kept sweeping, why Lucia kept flying, why they'd both refused to let go. Because someone, someday, would need them. And they'd be ready.